Another way to create a drop shadow in Photoshop is to use the actual image and its layer in order to create a drop shadow on for underneath the object. So in this case, trying to go in and hand paint a shadow with a brush is going to be much more difficult when we have an intricate object like this piece of bacon. So in order to create an object or shadow for this object, I'm going to go over to my layers panel, make these larger so you can see them, and I am going to command click on my layer to have that layer selected, and I'm going to create a new layer underneath this. So you can see there's my new layer, and I'm going to fill this with a color, basically a much darker color of my bacon. So I'm going to go back to my original layer here, use my eyedropper tool, sample a dark color, and then on my new shadow layer here, I'm going to fill that with a color. So this is going to be my shadow right here. Turn my bacon layer back on, and there's my shadow coming from my bacon. Clearly I have to go in and soften this. So with that layer, I'm going to filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and I'm going to blur this shadow out so that I get a nice soft shadow around my object, something that's going to look realistic. And so there is my shadow right there. A little bit too much. Okay, that looks just about right. Now I do want to add my anchor shadow in here as well to have that right up against my bacon. So again, I'm going to install a new layer. I'm going to command click on that existing layer, and I'm going to fill that with a slightly darker color as well. And there's my anchor shadow. I'm going to fill that, deselect it, and I'm going to move my anchor shadow down so you can see that little bit of an anchor shadow. And this one's going to get a little bit less of a blur. Choose filter blur. This one doesn't get anywhere near as much of a blur on it because I want that slight anchor shadow right at the very edge. I'm going to adjust the opacity down a bit so that I can have that so it's not quite as abrupt, but it's enough that it gives it some dimension right there. You can see that. And then my existing drop shadow. Now, it's never going to work very well if I have my drop shadow coming out the top. So I'm just going to grab my shadow layer here, and with my eraser tool, I'm just going to erase across the top of my shadow. Do the same thing with my anchor shadow as well, because I don't need that shadow poking out the top. It does not look realistic. Shadows never come out from the direction of the light. They're always going to be opposite of the direction of the light. So there's my bacon with the drop shadow. Now, what doesn't look realistic is this bacon is wrinkly. So this gives me a very consistent drop shadow overall so that it looks like the bacon is all one even surface. And it isn't. So I'm going to take my layers, I'm going to group them together into a group, and I'm going to apply a mask to this group, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to mask out the shadows here in ways to make it look like the bacon is closer to the surface or further away from the surface. Now with this, on my mask, any places where I want the bacon to appear like it's closer to the surface, clearly the drop shadow is going to be smaller because the bacon is not going to be off the surface as much. Other areas that it's going to be a little bit more extended, I'm going to have a little bit more of the shadow. So actually what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take my shadow and I'm going to poke it out further than I normally would to give me the ability here on my mask to mask those areas in or out. So with my mask selected, what I want to do is I want to mask those shadows closer to the bacon where it's going to be closer to the surface. So as I go in on my mask, I mask out those areas, and where the bacon sits closer to the surface, I can go in and I can add my mask to make it look like there's less of a shadow coming out. throw a little bit of texture in there as well, so I don't get a totally smooth shadow. And now what that gives me the illusion that I have a piece of bacon that is raised from the surface in areas like this, closer to the surface in areas like this, and I just go in and mask it in and mask it out. Now, if I turn off my mask, my shadow is still normal. Once I turn my mask back on, I can always go in and I can mask or unmask, and that gives me a much more realistic look and feel for my piece of bacon. And now I have it where the shadow varies with the height of the bacon away from the surface.